Yeah. Yes, Martha? Go ahead.
Afternoon, Prof.
Yeah.
Afternoon, colleagues.
Okay.
Prof, I wanted to find out, I did my, the assignment, the task that was supposed to be done on under module 4.
Okay.
But I wanted to find out whether the expectation was that we should use one of the framework to analyze, to do a gender analysis.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Use one of the frameworks to analyze gender.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Prof.
Okay. Thank you, Martha.
Mm.
Anyone else? No. Let's start. I think while others are joining. So we are moving into another step. We have started understanding various concepts of gender, including women's human rights and power for social change. And from that conceptual understanding, we move to understanding the tools that for us to analyze gender inequalities so that we can look for what opportunities exist to work on gender equality. So from the concepts to tools to now, we are looking in terms of what are the strategies that we can use for work on gender equality. So we'll be discussing 3 strategies, and then we will look for a discussion within that. Okay, now let's look at in terms of what we will be discussing today would be gender mainstreaming, gender advocacy, and gender budgeting as strategies for achieving gender equality. Let's look at first one in terms of gender mainstreaming. So what comes to you when you hear about mainstreaming? What's the mainstreaming? Can someone share? Because we use mainstreaming in different contexts. We use mainly in terms of disability, mainstreaming children with disability in mainstream education. So what does that mean when we say mainstreaming? Yes, Nancy.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. I understand the gender mainstreaming as a strategy to achieve equality between men and women.
Yeah.
And in this context, it means that you are able to integrate the gender perspectives in what you're doing. So if it is a program that has been, let's say, program that has been there for a while, and you find that there is missing participation of a certain gender, that's when now you purpose or you become intentional in ensuring that men or women or whoever has been discriminated is incorporated to benefit from what you're doing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Martha?
Thank you, Prof. In addition to Nancy, I understand that we need to integrate the concerns, the needs, and the experiences of both men and women when we are doing laws, policies, programs, and projects,
Okay.
so that they all are addressed and accommodated equally. Equally, of course, with equity and fairness in mind.
Okay. Thank you, Martha. Can we say what actually is mainstreaming? Yes, Cynthia?
Yes, good afternoon or morning, evening, everyone. Nice to be back. If I want to understand mainstreaming, this is how I will put it if I'm to explain. You acknowledge what was a reality that has existed.
Yeah.
You acknowledge that this is in existence, but it is not what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
You also acknowledge of what is currently trending, as it were. Let me use the word trending.
Yeah.
Then looking at what was, what is, what do I aim to achieve at the end? Maybe to correct what was in the past, or to make it better, or to focus. It's like a journey. You know, you have traveled this particular road and it didn't work. You agree? Yes. But my aim is to get to A, B, C, D. Then looking at where I started, what is there? Where did I go wrong? What is that? Who are those who can help me to achieve this? Then I can pilot my car to arrive at destination. That is how I will explain the concept of mainstreaming as a tool for whatever I want to achieve.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you for that. Anyone else? What does mainstreaming mean? Yes, Achang and Jaharul. Achang?
To me, I think mainstreaming is the process of including the needs, voices, or the wishes of the minority groups in the planning and implementation process of strategies or policies and procedures.
Thank you, Achang. Where are you from, Achang?
I am from Uganda.
Yes, Jaharul.
Thank you, Damoji. Thank you, everyone. Good morning, good evening. My understanding that gender mainstreaming means integrating a gender equality perspective or at all stages and levels of policies, programs, and projects. Gender mainstreaming ensures that policy making and legislative work is of higher equality and has a greater relevance for society because it makes policy response more effectively to the need of all citizens, women and men, girls and boys. Thank you, Damoji.
Thank you, Jaharul. Like, let's see, all what you have said is relevant, but I would like to present another perspective for you to consider. See, when do we say mainstream? There is something which is not part of it, but which is considered outside, but would like to become normal with others. I think rightly in terms of what Achang was saying, in terms of vulnerability is one aspect that you can consider. That's where we say in terms of mainstreaming children with disability into the mainstream education means main education. How do you treat children with a disability as equal? See, what we have seen in terms of gender has been more as an appendage, is something that is added on, more symbolic, but more in terms of seeing it as something different from other work. So mainstreaming actually says it is not different. It should not be seen as an appendage. It has to be seen as part of the main system. So therefore, mainstreaming is anything that is not, is treated equally, is treated outside, bringing that into the fold where everything exists. See, that's the mainstreaming. So therefore, in the case of gender, we have seen, I think most of us are witness to that. And we have seen in terms of gender as a separate entity, separate concept, separate work, and then dealing to our main work. So therefore, there are programs exclusively for women, and looking at that woman's work is related to gender. And we say that all other development programs are different. So although there is so much in terms of what you have been saying about integration, but in reality, it remained as an independent, as a exclusive component. So gender mainstreaming says it cannot be an independent, separate one. It has to be part of the main system, main work. That's the distinction I would like you to see it. So therefore, whatever we say on gender inequality or transforming that gender relations need to be not as a separate one, but has to be a main part of the programs and policies that we exist. So given that, I think we have already said, I think it's seen as a strategy for gender equality. I think many of you have emphasized this part of it. So what when we say mainstreaming is, how do you consider women, men, and other gender into all your work? It could be policies, it could be programs, or it could be practices, and in particular, the way that we communicate, the words that we use, the processes that we include in all our systems. How are they integrating the needs of different genders, women, men, and other gender? So therefore, why do we do it? Because the thing is we have seen equitable where the needs and situations are different for different people. And so therefore, when you are integrating the specific needs of different genders so that all of them can participate and benefit equally. So therefore, there is no inequality that continues. So the main purpose is in terms of how do we take the specific experience, interests, needs of women, men, and other gender so that they could benefit from the development. So as rightly was, I think Nancy was saying, we are looking in terms of participation, because one of the areas that deprives to treat them as outside is in terms of how much they participate, who participate, and for what purpose, whose views are considered. So participation is not in terms of just involving people for sharing your own perspective or approach, but in terms of how do we involve them in deciding what approach or what programs need to be taken. So therefore, in all decisions that you consider within the household or in the community or in our development programs or in terms of national policies and programs, how much different people participate and then they access the opportunities that exist. So therefore, I think these two things we need to consider. One is in terms of the integrating the concerns and experiences of different people. The second one is there is equal participation in terms of deciding what need to be done. So I think there is a lot of debate that was going around in the WhatsApp in terms of how do we look at gender equality and women's empowerment? Are they separate? Are they integral? Are they mutually reinforcing? We need to look at in terms of when we look up to gender equality, we are talking about everyone, all genders, men, women, and others to be equal in terms of their own experiences and their own needs. So while we focus on gender equality, where we are saying that all need to be equal, we also know that generations after generations, there is a particular group which is vulnerable, which is deprived, which is discriminated. So therefore, do you need an extra? Because for them to compete with, because equal opportunities cannot be accessed without considering the situation, the context, and the level playing field that all genders exist. I'm not only talking about women, but other gender, for example. So therefore, when we are looking in terms of this, how do we enable, how do you facilitate the most vulnerable groups to experience this, experience their power, to have control, is in terms of, that is where we are looking in terms of women's empowerment. So therefore, gender mainstreaming as a tool, as a strategy for gender equality is linked to women's empowerment. So therefore, it helps women to gain power. So they go hand in hand. So while we are saying when you have gender equality, it doesn't mean that you don't need to have specific focus on women's empowerment. There are two things which govern gender mainstreaming as a strategy, as a tool. One is certainly is in terms of the Nairobi World Conference on Women, which is 1985, and which was later adopted by Beijing Platform for Action, the gender streaming as a tool to promote gender equality. This was further emphasized in Magna Carta, which was of women, which was adopted in 2009, that gives a comprehensive women's human rights in terms of eliminating all forms of discrimination to fulfill their equality of rights. These are 6 aspects that we need to keep in mind. One, it's in terms of as an approach to equality, but integrating the concerns and experiences of different people, ensuring equal participation, looking in terms of women's empowerment as an integral part, which goes hand in hand with gender equality. So let's look at in terms of what are the fundamental elements when must exist when we say gender mainstream, or in another word, when we say gender mainstreaming, what are the different elements that it will focus or it should look into? First and foremost is in terms of, it's looking in terms of we know in terms of systems. That's what we have seen, both in terms of whether we looked in terms of concepts or in terms of tools, the patriarchal system, the societal systems, the institutional processes. Focus is going beyond that to see how are the relationship between different genders and what are the individual needs. So we are going from the larger picture to a specific thing in terms of wherever we work, how does it translate in terms of establishing the relation between different individuals and what are their needs. We knew in terms, when we looked at in terms as a basis for gender inequality, one of the building blocks is gender relations, which determine the status. So therefore, the relationship between the man, woman, and other gender, which is influenced by power, That's what we have seen. And how does that relationship exist? And what are the needs that different people have got? The second part that gender mainstream recognizes is that the structures are not gender neutral. They are biased. They are biased towards the men, because we all come, the people who occupy the structures are all part of the cultural process that we go through. So therefore, when we look at the structures or the policies that are formulated by that structure are contributing to perpetuating the gender equality. So therefore, when we are looking at gender, we cannot just take for granted that that is the systems exist that we can take it forward. We need to be critical in terms how those systems, how those structures are contributing or not contributing to gender equality. The third one is it believes that if you work with focused attention, then the gender, we know in terms of gender is a social construct, and social, I think, as rightly, I think in the WhatsApp somebody was saying, social you can always deconstruct because it is a social construct. So therefore, the belief is that you can change, but it requires that a perseverant effort over a period of time, so that that gender construct can be deconstructed. So what we are looking in terms of when we are saying gender mainstreaming, it should look at in terms of how are they, I think people have said in different ways. I think how do we look at the existing power relations between women and other gender by the systems and institutions, and to transform them. So therefore, when we are saying gender mainstreaming, it should look at the existing power relations and then transforming those relations. And the one which we were saying, so when we are looking in terms of gender mainstreaming, when we are saying that bring the gender integrated into that, it doesn't exclude that you will have a specific affirmative actions on women's needs, women's empowerment. At the organizational level, I think this is also one of the activities in the forum. When we are all coming from organizations, whether it could be a non-governmental organization or maybe government or some people who may be activists as in their own way, we are all looking in terms of that this exists in terms of commitment to gender equality or mainstreaming gender at their senior leadership level. So therefore, when they are looking in terms of organizational strategies, organizational policies, they look at that this is reflected. How is this practiced? So in whatever, wherever we are, we find that people are saying that they are involved in mainstreaming. One is certainly, as we said, it must be challenging the socially constructed patterns of gender relations. So one is in terms of understanding and challenging it and transforming those patterns in terms of norms and rules throughout society. The third one is look at we have been saying in terms of how different people participate. So women, men, and other gender, how do they participate? How do they influence the policies and program so that they benefit equally? So therefore, when we are looking gender mainstreaming, we also look at what is the role played by each of these gender in terms of not only sharing what are the needs specific to them, but also looking in terms how is this translated into action. And we need to look at in terms, as we said, gender analysis, because how do you really get in terms of what is the existing patterns is to conducting a gender analysis. So all strategies, whether it is gender mainstreaming or gender advocacy and budgeting, it involves in terms of how do we analyze gender inequality that exists in the context. So therefore, it looks in terms of what are the gaps, what are the structural causes, and how do we transform them? How do we look at that to overcome them? What are the new ways that we need to have so that the policies are related to the needs of people? So therefore, it demands that the structures and then the strategies of working must be different. So when we are saying gender mainstreaming, if the same systems, the same practices continue, then it is not mainstreaming. So mainstreaming need to look at critically, one in terms of whether the existing way the organizations, the communities, or the state is functioning, where are the gaps in terms of considering the needs of all people together in terms of the relationships and addressing those relationships. So therefore, it is political and it is in terms of demanding changes in the way that we do. So it influences, therefore it influences the reorganization of policy processes so that it integrates the actual needs and priorities of different gender. The other one we need when we are saying gender mainstreaming, although it is essential that it is driven by a top leadership, but the scope and the need of the gender mainstreaming need to be understood and internalized by all people across all levels. So everyone, it is not only at the top leadership, right through the organization, right through the levels of community or the state, everyone recognizes and then accepts and practices gender mainstreaming in all the work that they do. So therefore, it requires that wherever it is, whether it is a development program or a policy or an organization, it need to look at that their strategies and practices need to have a changed goals that respond to the existing gaps that exist in the system. So therefore, in the same thing in terms when specific to organizations is looking in terms of policy structures. This is where we looked in terms of participation. We have been looking at in terms how gendered is the leadership positions and the decision-making level thing. So it has to be that not only participation at all levels, that and then the proportion of women and men and other gender occupying leadership position. So these are the aspects that we need to look into. So what we have done is in terms of gender mainstreaming, what approaches and strategies guide the gender mainstreaming. We looked in terms of what are the fundamental elements of gender mainstreaming and how is those elements translated into practice. Let me pass and then see whether there are any questions so far. Yes, Cynthia.
I would want to explain something, then you let me know whether I've understood this gender mainstreaming.
Please go
You
ahead.
said something about all stakeholders should be involved, but we must have affirmative actions to be able to arrive at the equality. I remember at the beginning of this course when we talked about gender equality and gender equity. So mainstreaming will be like using affirmative structures or strategies or methodology that will give somebody, we know I'm short and you're tall. For us to arrive at being able to harvest the mango, maybe you give me a ladder while the other person can stand and reach. But because of that ladder you have given to me, I'm able to also harvest the mango. That is it the, will I say, this explanation, does it talk about gender mainstreaming? Because that's what is coming up for me. Am I correct?
Yeah, you are
understanding that way?
very much, very much. So therefore, I think
Thank
it's a combination of, when we talk about equality and equity, I mean, that's where the gender mainstream is a strategy. How do we translate that? We know that there
Thank
are,
you.
equalities, gender equalities. How do those gender equalities are benefiting people? That's where the equity comes. I think you are right, Cynthia. Thank you for that. Then Peno Singhe.
Okay, thank you and good afternoon, Prof. I just want to understand better the word when we are saying the need of men and women and other gender. The other gender, can we be specific so that at least I understand it better?
Okay. Yeah, where are you from, Pensinghe?
I'm from Namibia.
Okay. Thank you for asking that question. Yeah. Other gender is in terms of, there are many other identities that are there. It could be transgender, it could be lesbian, it could be those forms that when I said other gender, because I did not want to name everyone, but other gender identities that exist. So we are talking about, so one of the argument that we get is in terms of, is it only a binary? Because we often say woman, men, but there are beyond that identity. So therefore, when I said other gender includes not the binary, which is other identities. I'm giving examples in terms of the lesbians, transgender. Does it clarify?
Okay, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pensinghe. Okay, let's, can we move forward and get into the next one?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyone has got any other questions on gender mainstreaming? Melubo, you are correct. Yes. A process of making something that is not normal by making it normal. Yeah. Normal, regular, because something which is outside, you think that it is not part of the main system. So getting that into the system. Yeah. So that it becomes normal. It is not outside. It is not an appendage. Okay. Martha?
Thank you, Prof. Can Prof explain again when you say gender mainstreaming is political? I don't understand it very well.
Okay. So political in the sense, political is something in term where it is a struggle. Is in terms of that there is always someone who will, there is something which is there, but you would challenge that. So that's where, if you look at, very simple is in terms of people in the political parties. What do? They look at in terms of how do they challenge other person, so that they either, it is done both for a positive and a negative. Political parties may use it more for their own benefit, to see in terms of what are the gaps that exist and challenging that. Challenging is in terms of that there is need for a change. So why do we challenge? Because there is something that is not happening, that is or not relevant, that is harmful. So therefore you need to be change. So challenge is to bring change, and change is not easy. It is disturbing for people. So when we are looking in terms of that gender analysis, the gender mainstreaming, you can only do, you can, is a strategy to follow. But how do you, the starting point is analyzing the gender. Analyzing the gender is in terms of what the gaps exist. And the mainstream, gender mainstream says, if how do we address these gaps in reality, in practice? So when you are doing it, you are actually in challenging the existing structure, existing system, existing policy. And that challenging demands that there is need for a change. So political is always has got one, challenging the status quo, challenging the situation, and looking for change. When these two things exist, it's political in nature, because you are talking about change in power relationships, change in the situation, change in the practices that exist, which deprives someone and which provides privileges to others. So therefore, it is seen more as political. Political is in terms of demanding a change in the situation. Martha, is that
Thank you,
clear?
Prof. Thank you very much, Prof. It's very clear.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on. The second strategy that we have is a gender advocacy. I think there are many people in the group who are very activists. Let's look at how do you understand advocacy. What comes to you when you said advocacy? Yes, Cynthia. Please
For
go ahead.
me,
Yeah.
yes, when I talk about advocacy, number one, I'm talking about standing in the gap for those who might not be able to do something for themselves, speak for themselves.
Okay.
Practical example.
Yeah.
I have served in the counter trafficking in persons, speaking out for the victims, particularly victims who are used for criminal activities, trying to advocate that any activity a victim of human trafficking indulges in that is criminal, such a person cannot be held liable because it wasn't done.
Yeah.
The laws are there, but the foot soldiers, those on ground that either arrest or do, might not be aware of these. So education, awareness campaign all fall under methodology I used to advocate for these victims. Also for the refugees and the migrants and all that.
Okay.
Sometimes lobbying, especially when you meet officials who might be aware of laws,
Yeah.
but are looking for loopholes. This thing about you say change is not easy.
Yeah.
When we are so comfortable where we are, it is so difficult, even when we know that what we are doing is not really correct.
Yeah.
But moving out of that comfort zone of this is where we are, this is how we've been doing it. It hasn't. Rocking the boat is advocacy. Let me use another language for advocacy. Yeah. Actually rocking the boat, yeah, to create awareness, to make people come out of their complacency or ostrich behavior. Because sometimes we don't want to know. Then we pretend, because when I know, yeah, I have to be responsible on how I use that money. So I pretend not to know. So for me, that is advocacy.
Yeah. Thank you, Cynthia. Yeah, I think I underline what you said is in terms of that standing with people, with vulnerable people, of the cause of their vulnerable people. I think that's the bottom line of advocacy. Helena?
Thank you.
Yeah.
For me, I would have defined advocacy in many ways.
Okay.
Is to build capacity, to make people aware of certain issues affecting them, to make them familiar with these issues, and to help them create change. Yeah, and then you make them aware of existing structures towards achieving these goals in creating the change. Yeah, that's how simple I can put it.
Thank you, Helena. I think, yeah, I think about it is influencing something, bringing change. Very good. Jessica,
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon.
good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Yeah. Thank you. Jessica, please go ahead. Yeah, share your comment, please.
In my
Thoughts?
view,
Yeah.
advocacy is it's like public action.
Yeah.
Trying to convince the public of a certain belief
Yeah.
or idea that someone has
Yeah.
or a group of people have.
Yeah.
So they organize themselves to campaign specifically for the less marginalized. It
Yeah.
could be women
Yeah.
who are less marginalized. It could be the youth who are less marginalized. It
Yeah.
could be people living with disability. But that belief that there is need for them to be hand off, or that belief that there is need for a change
Kuja
that can
nikusaidie.
transform,
Huwezi vuruta
or
kama hii bado itachi.
that can transform whatever is happening for the benefits of those people that we are campaigning for.
Thank you, Jessica. Mary and Catalina.
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
I think mine is not different from what my colleagues have said.
Okay.
Advocacy is pushing for an idea.
Okay.
Like maybe you sense there is a problem.
Yeah.
Just like the others have said, maybe it is something to do with the marginalized people. Maybe there is something not going, something that is not going on right.
Yeah.
You know, something you feel is not right. It could be something maybe like child marriage. It could be like violence or any other thing, maybe something to do with the people with the disability.
Yeah.
So you get like, this is not right.
Yeah.
And you start acting to push that, you know,
Yeah.
there is change, like these people are treated better, like a certain practice has to stop. So it is really pushing for an idea for change for me.
Thank you, Mary. Catalina?
Hi.
Hi.
I think advocacy moves from mainstreaming,
Yeah.
identifying there's a gap in the lives of the people,
Okay.
creating the awareness,
Yeah.
and then lobbying for it or working towards that gap or whatever it's not in the mainstream, be put in the mainstream. So it is the work you put in and then make it work that it's put into policy. Yeah.
Thank you, Catalina. That was good. Let's move. So I think all that what we have said, I think it's, so therefore, when we look in terms of gender advocacy, is it need to look at in terms of, we know on terms of what we push here is a gender equality. So what policies exist and what changes need to do it, but it need to be around how do we contribute to gender equality? What is required to deepen, to widen gender equality? Therefore, I think as you all said, it's pushing, it is influencing, it's enabling, asking, challenging, and campaigning that there is need for reforms in the legislation, either in terms of revising it or enacting new things, because we need to look at this when you talk about campaigning or demanding a change, it need to have a legitimacy, legal framework. So therefore, the legislations give us that foundation for us to campaign and take action for equality. This is also in terms of, if you look at, this is what CEDAW Article 2 and 3 is talking about. It requires obligation of the state to review the existing policies and strategies to see whether they are contributing or not contributing to gender equality, so that there is need for a review, revising it, If not, if there are gaps, then coming with new things. So what we are looking at is in terms of how do we strengthen the existing system? The existing system is in terms of where we are talking about public policies, which are instruments in ensuring that there is a equitable governance on people. So therefore, how does different interests of men, women, and other gender are reflected in the policies and are accurately formulated, and then whether the outcomes that it delivers are monitored. So therefore, constantly what we are advocating is, does the policies reflect the realities on the ground? Does it really integrate into formulating those policies? And thirdly, when they are enforcing it, when they are implementing it, do they monitor that the expected outcomes reach to the intended participants? So therefore, it looks in terms of, to provide this, that it need to get a gender disaggregated data, so that you can look at in terms of what is the difference that exists. And so therefore, it also looks in terms whether it is specific when it is formulating policies and programs, whether it is specific to them or not. And lastly, gender advocacy is strengthened by alliances, because I think one of you have said, I think we talked about voices. How do we represent? Because certainly in terms of we may represent, but I think what is more important is people who are experiencing the problem, is the issue. They need to voice. Our role is to stand with them to provide that. In that, we as a civil society and other people, how do we join? How do we express our solidarity? So therefore, gender advocacy invariably involves an alliance with different actors. I think, as Cynthia was mentioning, is in terms of the different stakeholders. How do different stakeholders also realize the need for this change? And they express solidarity in the struggle that people make. Because any policy change is not easy. One is in terms of the people who are capable of, or who are responsible to make policies, need evidence, need data, and also need demands to see that they need to look at change. So therefore, that since it's not easy, one single voice may not be enough. There is need for a multiple voice, and that's where we need to look at not only vulnerable people, but other organizations who are concerned with vulnerable communities need to join. So these are significant that we need to keep in mind. What principles gender advocacy must have? Certainly in terms of, it must target the national and global policy frameworks. What are the policies that exist? Certainly in terms of national, where you have greater control and eventually which can influence the global policies. And we are looking in terms of on gender equality. What exists, what gaps exist, and how do we address those gaps? So therefore, the reference for us is in terms of the existing national policies and the frameworks. And it need to look at, certainly, I think we have been saying, it need to be rooted in the reality, what exists on the ground. So therefore, it believes in providing evidence. What exists on the ground need to be given with facts and figures. And so therefore, if we want to influence the policymakers, they need the evidence so that they convinces them. It appeals, makes an appeal, good appeal. So we are looking in terms of agency of people. It could be women, it could be people, it could be any others, not only in terms of within their private sphere, but also in the public, that they take the control, they express, they take charge, while we are all facilitators in the whole thing. And certainly we are looking in terms of the participation of all. And if it is related to children, we are looking in terms of the boys and girls also to be part of that participation. And lastly, inclusion of rights holders. Invariably, that's where we are looking in terms of people who are experiencing the problem. They need to be. So therefore, we know we need to target the national policies. There must be sound evidence of facts on the ground, and where people take action with equal participation, and then voicing their concerns at different forums so that their voice is heard. So what are the elements that the gender advocacy could have? So it could be two. One, in terms of, it can also look at what are the gaps that exist in the existing policies, or it can look at in terms of what are the areas that is not considered by policy, which demands a new policy. So therefore, from micro action, is there something that the state need to consider to enact policy? Or if there are gaps that exist in terms of enforcement or in terms of its own focus, what is that we can do? Using a gender lens, using gender equality, how does it contribute to? So therefore, what we are looking in terms of when we identify, the second is we analyze what are the consequences of these gaps. What are the harmful effects on people due to this absence of this policy or a gap in the policy, in terms of the impact that it has on different people. Having identified the problem, analyzed the problem, it need to come up with what options that we are suggesting. What options emerges from this analysis? What is that we would like to demand? What is that we would like to communicate to policymakers of the need? And this, as we have been saying, in terms of focus on the strategic gender needs. While we are saying focus, it is not undermining the practical needs, but we need to look at how do we also equally give focus on the strategic gender needs that you were able to identify from the analysis. So it could be in terms of whether you bring change in the existing policies or you go for new policies. The fourth one is, having done this, generating what options that would emerge from the analysis, you look into whether that becomes that the entire community or the group that experiencing that problem, they own that. So you need to build a collective ownership. You may need somebody to facilitate that analysis, but at the end of it, that everyone need to be involved, and at least people who are experiencing, they need to take ownership of both in terms of analysis as well as in terms of options that emerges from the analysis. So therefore, for you to make a real voice, that you need other stakeholders. So therefore, you need to look at who are the other people, who are the other civil society members, organizations, including media, who are supportive, who have got similar agenda, and how do you seek their solidarity for your options. And then raise awareness. That's where your campaign will come in terms of how do you mobilize and how do you raise policy dialogue with people who are involved. That's where the lobbying, I think two of you have been saying it, lobbying will come. And then the people who are, they need to mobilize, they need to show because after all, you need to look at in terms of advocacy can only be effective if you can show with numbers. One is in terms of the data, the other in terms of the people, in terms of mass. And then having done, whether the policy is reviewed or new act come, we need to look at in terms of gender advocacy involves monitoring the enforcement of those policies at periodic level, so that you give feedback in terms of, because after all, why we are influencing a particular policy is to ensure that the people benefit. So therefore, there may be, that's one of the constant argument that we have been making is policies are there, they are very fine, but the gap is in terms of implementation. So therefore, there is we need to look at in terms of gender advocacy, including monitoring policies, so that you become a watchdog to tell in terms of where the gaps are and then how the government must respond to. Quick feedback on gender advocacy, and then maybe we looked in terms of what's the purpose of gender advocacy, said that we need to influence legislative reforms or new legislations that reflect the interests of different gender. And we looked in terms of it must target the national global thing, must be rooted in the realities on the ground with evidence through people's agency with equal participation and voicing their concerns. And we looked in terms of what are the basic elements. One, identifying the problem, analyzing the problem, articulating the options, policy options that it comes out, generating ownership, establishing solidarity with the stakeholders, raising public awareness, and then monitoring those policies. Before we move to the next, any quick comments? Yes, Martha.
Thank you, Prof, for explaining this gender advocacy very well. I now, and you have to correct me, I'm trying now to clarify my own understanding. I now understand that what we are also doing as gender machineries within governments, it's part of gender advocacy. But then I think I used to think that civil society organizations are more involved in gender advocacies, and maybe trying to make government pass some laws or some policies that government is not passing. So I see the role of the role of civil society organization as vital in the gender advocacy, because as government, we can have our policies and so on, but we may not be able to successfully, successfully campaign for change from within. So it's just my own, I'm just thinking aloud along those lines.
Yeah, I think, Martha, you were right. I think we need to look at in terms, certainly, see, sometimes this advocacy is very loosely used, but a person who refers to advocacy only in terms of public advocacy is in terms of, it's only the state which can make policies, and those are public policies. And there is certainly a machinery, a process, and a procedure to form that thing. So we are looking into all those things. And the policies is only an outcome, but those evolve through a process and procedure. So there is a lack, there is a gap in those processes, and we may have to look at in terms of, so therefore, sometimes the policies may be good, but in terms of the the procedures that the policy implementation may be discriminatory, maybe disadvantageous for a particular section of people. So therefore, the role of civil society, role of NGOs is to, because the state by and large is used to denying the facts on the ground. And they would say that all policies are good and their implementation is perfect. But it is we who are on the ground, who see the gaps, should become the watchdog and then tell the institution, tell the machinery, government machinery, where the gaps are. And for that, we need evidence and we need people to represent. Yeah. Thank you, Martha and Cynthia and Mary.
Okay, I want to follow up from what Martha said. You have already answered it.
Yeah.
The civil society is like a watchdog.
Yeah.
We are the conscience of the government.
Yeah.
If I have a problem and I'm in government, I'm not going to correct it by myself, as it were. It needs a voice to say, these policies are there, what is happening? And it is those on ground, maybe I refer myself as a grassroots responder that see how these policies are implemented. Then we speak out and then we lobby. Then we keep on. I will just give this example. When I came to Botswana as a missionary in 2008, I had been involved in the anti-human trafficking back in my home country. It was actually the women religious of Nigeria who pushed our government to do the needful. Arriving in Botswana, first, the one who has to advocate, like you say, facts, has to be aware of the relevant legislation. Because the advocate has to be a politician, has to be a diplomat, has to be a voice that speaks without speaking. You play so many roles, but at the end of the day, you are the voice of the one who has no voice. So I bought the Constitution, I bought the Penal Code, I looked at the laws, international, regional laws on trafficking. We discovered that my country, Botswana, is a signatory to the Palome Convention, had ratified it, but did not criminalize the offense. So what was our campaign? Because we had the relevant laws. We lobbied, we organized workshops, we created awareness. Oh, we have these laws. You are this a signatory to this international convention. You have already ratified it. You had the protocol, you're part of it, which means you are obliged. When you have your facts and you're an advocate, the one who does not want to change or implement will be pushed to, because there are also international, how do I say, indicators on how to, because we had been on tier 3 for years, meaning the laws were signatory, but we didn't implement. So each time the UN does their analysis, we on tier 3. But eventually with the lobby, 2015 or 2014, we had laws. 2015, it came into full operation. Now we have raised to tier 2.
Yeah.
Tier 1 means if there are people arrested on charges of human trafficking, with these laws we have as our own national laws, they are able to be prosecuted. At least we've had one prosecution, which is a plus.
Yeah.
So without these things, it's not easy for one to advocate.
Yeah.
So you have to have a good knowledge of the phenomenon. When it comes to women empowerment and all that, what are the cultural norms in a diverse culture, let's say like Botswana? I was in the North before, this issue of child marriage. Then we started empowering the people that the national laws are higher than cultural laws if you are within a country. Example of, sometimes court cases, we use it as example. The way you create it, the next time a father is agreeing that a 13-year-old should be given out in marriage, He said, if they come, they can arrest me. I can actually be tried for this. That is where the change occurs, because the advocate is aware of the different levels of the law. Last but not the least, the advocate must be patient.
Yeah.
Some of the things we as women, I call myself a woman, I'm enjoying today, started as far back as in the 18th, 19th century. Women who dared the status quo and spoke out. They never lived to see what we have gained, even though we are still crying today. But they never saw it in their time. So the advocate, especially in things that have been so institutionalized at various levels, even in my beautiful church, yes, we agree and we talk about it. The patriarchy, it's so institutionalized that it will be difficult to change. We push, we wait.
Yeah.
We push, we wait. My symbol of the advocate is the turtle.
Yeah.
But he knows where he's going. He push, he will wait. He uses every avenue, whatever, networking, advocating, getting people on your side, lobbying, looking for people who think alike, even those who don't think alike, creating a conscience within them and things like that. Change does not happen in one day. That's all I want to contribute.
Thank you, Cynthia. I think we need to look at that policy work is not overnight thing. It requires a perseverant effort, perseverant follow-up. We need to look at, we need to keep on following it up for a change. Certainly change will come, but it will come and it requires a deliberate attempt. Mary?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, sister. I find like the national laws, the international laws to be quite general. You know, yeah, they are very general in that when we talk equality, what we mean by equality in Kenya may differ again from the aspects in Botswana and India, you know? Yeah, so for us, we've been advocating for, like where I live in Busia, there is so much gender violence, especially sexual violence against children. And we've been advocating to have Busia county-specific gender policies, because our problem may not be the same problem with what is in central Kenya. Even the root causes of our problems, like issues, gender violence, may not be like what is in other parts of the country. So we lobbied the National Gender and Equality Commission. And right now, every county is putting down their own county-specific SGBV policy. In Busia, we have already done the public participation. We are waiting to take it to the county assembly. Like countries are like family. What is in my family may not be what is in another family. It is not. And so when we talk about advocacy, when we talk about policy, we need to really calm down. We may have national policy, but they may not be very adequate for everybody in every part of the country. So that person must be reached, and that community that need to have their own specific policies that touch on their root causes. And that's what we are advocating for in Kenya now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I think that was a wonderful narrative. Let's move from advocacy to budgeting. We all know that we are talking about public budgeting, and which is allocation of resources. So here we are looking, when we said gender budgeting, we are saying in terms of the existing allocation, public allocations, to see it from a gender perspective, where the decisions on allocations, there is a participation of women and other gender, and also in terms of, not only in terms of allocation, but also in terms of spending, that there is equity. So there is equity in terms of allocation. There is equity in terms of spending public allocations with a gender perspective so that it meets the needs of women, men, and other gender. So therefore, it need to look at when we say the public allocations need to be oriented, we are looking that it must address the inequality and discrimination that exists towards women and other gender identities, inclusive budgeting, and considering women as contributors to economic advancement. So that's where we need to look at in terms of how the women's unpaid care work is undervalued. So that is completely out of your budgeting. So we need to look at in terms, not only in terms of their productive earnings, but even their reproductive role also has a contribution, economic contribution. So the second aspect we are looking at, while there is a public allocation reorientation, we need to look at how does it address the inequality, how does it become inclusive of gender, and lastly, in terms of recognizing that women have contribution to make. So it involves understanding what are the different needs of women and understanding the differential impact that the budgets have on what type of goals that we can set. So therefore, when there are civil society organizations which will look in terms of gender budgeting as well as tracking the budget. So how is it meeting the differential needs and what impact the budgets have on women and men, so that you set, when we are saying when you are involved in gender budgeting, means you involve how a gender budgeting can become gender for gender equality. So certainly we need to look at, when we say gender, but we are not looking that there is a separate budget for men and women, but we are talking about a single budget which looks at gender equality. So what are the processes in gender budgeting? Like in terms of gender advocacy, we need to look at the existing policies and budgets, how gender blind they are or how gender responsive they are. We'll come to in terms of the continuum of gender in the next session. But we need to look at, there is something which ignores gender and there is something which considers gender perspective, gender equality. So we are looking both in terms, because the budgets also need to respond to the policies that are existing. So therefore, when we are looking in terms of gender budgeting, we analyze gender budgets with reference to gender policies to see how gender responsive or gender sensitive they are, and how are they contributing to increasing or decreasing gender equality. So therefore, what it requires is this analysis. We need to keep a few parameters very clear. One, it needs to examine the inclusion of gender and what progress it has made. Particularly, it needs to look at in terms of how are the gender hierarchies influence the budget. Gender hierarchies, I'm not saying in them culturally constructed gender hierarchies. You have men, you have women, you have other gender. These are how the hierarchies exist in society. Does the budget reflect those gender hierarchies? And what opportunities are extended to women and other gender? Are they equitable? What is the ability of those budgets in decreasing gender inequality, detect discrimination, and what priority is given to gender equality and women's empowerment? So when we are saying that how gender blind and how gender responsive is budgets, public budgets, need to be seen from these angles in terms of how is gender perspective included, how are gender hierarchies are influencing, what opportunities, how equitable are those opportunities to different gender, and what is its ability to decreasing the gender inequality, and what priority it gives to gender equality and women's empowerment. So therefore, when we audit this budget, we need to incorporate the gender differences that are embedded in the gender roles, gender differences in terms of what roles are assigned to the different genders. So what processes we should have? So we need to look at in terms of advocating for implementation of gender responsive budget that focuses on inequality, address concern, restructuring budgets to respond to the gender gaps and meeting the differential needs. So we are looking in terms of how when we look at differential needs, how are the budgets are giving scope for increasing the accessibility of public services. We knew, particularly in terms of public services, whether it is in terms of nutrition, health, it's women depend more on the public services. So how do we build the process? That's where I was saying, in terms whether it is a policy formulation or budgeting, it involves a process, and those processes, how those processes can be gender responsive at all levels so that it addresses gender inequality. So there must be a regular tracking of the budget to see whether the budgeting is relevant to the needs of men, women, and others. What is the differing impact it has on different genders? How is the participation of people? How is it meeting the diversity, and what barriers are there? Like we said, in terms of policy monitoring, there is also a budget monitoring that we need to look at whether it contributes to gender equality or it enhances gender inequality. We need to look at, that's where we are said in terms of when the gender mainstreaming, that the structures are not gender neutral. The systems are not gender neutral, they are biased. So therefore, when there is a policy and when there is a budgeting, this is where we need to come in. I think Cynthia has been saying time and again, how does that culture enters into all spheres? And the people who come from the same culture, who occupy the positions of leadership and decision making, how do they influence their socialization, their cultural practices into the policies and budgets? So we need to guard. So therefore, in both policies and budgeting, there is a tracking, and there are institutions which are concerned about that. This is where I think gender budgeting is also a watchdog activity in terms of how are the budgets gender responsive in terms of allocations with equitable allocation as well as spending. And so therefore we are also need to look at whether that gender responsiveness is also reflected in utilization, in spending. So what impact the budget is making on women, men, and other gender, including children, boys and girls. And we need to look at in terms of the strategies that would come. So having said in terms of what purpose, what processes that we need to keep in mind. What is the scope of gender budgeting? What challenges exist? We have been saying in terms of, we are not looking in terms of two separate budgets. So therefore, when we say that there is the equitable gender budget locations, gender budgeting must look at in terms of spending part of it. Is it addressing the differential needs? Therefore, the scope that gender budgeting provides us is that we can argue, we can demand for gender equal allocation and spending, so that it is addressing the needs of differential needs. So emphasis need to be on intersectional factors. We have been saying it time and again, intersectional factors, because the inequality and poverty are intersectional. So the discrimination that different vulnerable groups face is based on different social parameters. So therefore, we need to emphasize on how does this intersectional factors affects different genders. So therefore, the budgeting is informed by these intersectional factors, so that it improves the conditions of women and men. What we must guard is that it is not simple listing of expenditures that we spend on women or other gender, but we need to look at how does that impact the strategic gender needs of different people. So we need to recognize that if we don't review policies and budgets through a gender lens, it might continue to reinforce the inequality, and the woman and other gender will remain disadvantaged. This also need to look at in terms of the taxation on different aspects. Though we may be working in one particular, but it still need to look at how does taxation affect the different situations, needs, and priorities. So I think from my side, I think let's look at what's the reflection on gender budgeting. So we looked in terms of what purpose. We said that we reorienting public allocations with an equity principle involving people themselves, to look at how does it address inequality and discrimination, and how does it consider women as the contributors, involves in understanding differential needs and differential impact budgets can have, and setting goals for equality, requiring analyzing the policies to understand how blind or responsive they are, from in terms of how is it including gender, how is gender hierarchies influencing the budget, what opportunities are extended to women and other gender, how equitable are they, whether they are contributing to decreasing the inequality. How do we look at gender differences in terms of looking in terms of there is a gender responsive budget that addresses the gender norms, restructuring budget to meet differential needs, building a process of gender responsive budgeting through a regular tracking of budget to look at how relevant is the allocation, how is it equitable in spending, what impact it has, what barriers exist, so that it provides in terms of, it helps in terms of meeting the differential needs and improving our decision making with understanding on intersectional factors. So any comments? I will stop the screen and I'll see one. Yes, Peggy. Peggy, go ahead. Peggy, you raised your hand. You have something to share? Yes, Jessica, go ahead while Peggy is getting ready.
Okay, thank you very much for
Yeah.
that very, very informative presentation.
Yeah.
And my comment is that we have very good policies,
Yeah.
especially in Kenya,
Yeah.
very good policies in the region.
Yeah.
But one of the main issues is that they are not implemented.
Yeah.
Due to various factors. My second point is that if you look at the various policies that we have so many. Generally, they are not gender responsive.
Yeah.
They are gender blind.
Yeah.
This includes the gender policy 2016, which is being implemented by the various ministries or the various sectors in Kenya. And where the gender policy talks of gender budgeting, I think it is easier said than done. There is a whole paragraph on gender budgeting, but when we visit the many institutions that we have, they talk of gender sensitive budgeting, gender policies, but if you look at the details of those policies, there is no item such as gender budgeting. You lobby for it, you advocate for it, and because most of the decision makers are men who do not understand what gender is or what gender sensitive, gender responsive policies are, then it's like you are eating, you are not able to, it becomes an uphill task to convince the policy makers because they really do not understand what gender responsive policies are and what gender responsive budgeting is. For me, it is an uphill task.
Yeah.
I have looked at the various gender policies that exist in the country, and for sure, they are gender blind. That's my contribution.
Thank you, Jessica. I think that's a reality on the ground. That's where I think you also said in terms of that's the role that the civil society need to play in terms of how do you hold the state accountable to the promises that they have made. As you said, I think there are policies, there are budgets, but it's not implemented. It's not responsive. So how do you create this? I think is what we need to look at in terms, how does this gender sensitivity? That's where I was saying in terms of gender mainstreaming is also, when we said gender budgeting, is also a mainstreaming gender. So that need to be across all levels. So not only in terms of policymakers make the policies, but people down the line who are responsible for implementation also need to have the same understanding and commitment to translate that into action. Thank you, Jessica, for raising that. I completely agree, but we cannot leave it like that. We need to move step by step how to change that situation. Anyone else? Icefin? Yes, Helena?
Am I audible now? Okay.
Yes, Helena. Yes.
Okay,
please.
Mine will just take us a bit behind. I'm taking ourselves back to where we started. And from all that we've been discussing, my understanding is very simple.
Yeah.
For us to achieve any of these policies and frameworks we are talking about, before we address the issue of gender equality and equity for all parties, both men, women, and other genders, to understand what it means, as opposed to being understood as women taking away power, as opposed to it being understood as the boy child or the men are being neglected. As long as we don't work hard to make this issue understood, then it is going to be an uphill task to make some of these frameworks really fall in place. Yes.
Yeah, you're right, Rena. I think that this is where we need to look at in terms of how much, because the governments have been using this tactics of denial of facts. So do we also follow suit, or do we question the realities? I think that's where we need to present in terms whatever you have said. In terms, there is an inequality, there is discrimination. It certainly is contextual, it is relative, and we need to look at in terms of what is that relative discrimination and inequality. We are not for one gender over the other, but we are for in terms of the against inequality wherever it exists. So how do we address that? I think that's the bottom line. I think, Helena, I would agree. Whatever equity that we may talk about, do we understand that there is an issue of equity in the existing situation? And that's, I think, that we need to accept, recognize, and realize this fact so that it informs how do we contribute to bringing that down? How do you contribute to decreasing that inequality? Ruth and then Aiswin.
Thank you for this opportunity. Listening to Jessica, she has really painted a great picture of what situations are, apparently for Kenya, but for African countries, I think our notes are the same. And it makes me think that, you know, we might want to point fingers on the policy makers and the leaders, but then again, I'm thinking probably they don't have the knowledge that we know. Because most of the time you'll find those leaders come from different backgrounds. Some are teachers, but they find themselves in some positions in leadership. And so then I feel that they also need capacity building or a program like this for them, so that people are picked from different departments, people who matter, people who put their hands on the policies and on the budgeting and all these things. So that when their capacity builds to be in a certain position, a certain level like we, then maybe probably we can see the change. Because then I feel most of the time we as civil societies want to work on things and we desire change, but we are not having them on board at the same level. And so for this reason, Damo, maybe probably ahead here, I'll have to look for you so that we see on what we can do specifically for my county, where we have a lot of injustices, especially for women and girl children. I hope you'll be available. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. I think we need to recognize, I think there are two facets, Ruth, in terms of the machinery not being, I think there is one issue is about the awareness, the other issue is about the attitude. People may not be aware of it.
Yes.
So therefore, probably providing that awareness might help. But the second one is this attitude that demands a challenge. We need to challenge that. But is it in terms of the gender stereotypical attitude, and then the condoning the inequality that exists? Is it running through the structures and the leadership? If that is the case, probably I think there is need for challenging it, and that challenge need to have the data and the people together. Thank you,
I
Ruth.
agree.
Yeah,
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Aiswin.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And all my colleagues till now have made some really excellent points. And I would like to, put my thoughts across, and specifically in context of India, here I'd like to say that when we're talking about attaining gender equality, empowerment, and gender equity, I think it's when we're talking about working with governments and governments being the agencies that can carry out change or having the authority and power to implement change in our society, I think it's also important to recognize that we must also have the primary stakeholders about whom we're taking decisions be present in the picture. We cannot take decisions about the welfare and well-being of women and other racial and ethnic minorities or gender minorities without having them involved there. Their voice needs to be included. They need to be represented. We can be allies. We can give them a platform where they can talk about their grievances, but we cannot be we cannot just talk about changing circumstances for them and societal narrative about them without having them included there. So I feel like it is important that when we're talking about achieving all the other solving the social issues, we must take into account what their what their stance is, what their feelings are about the whole issue, and how they feel the government agency is doing. So I think if we can have the primary stakeholders, be it women, be it any other gender minority or racial or ethnic minority, speak up on that platform, I think we will have a very holistic blueprint of how we can change the society, how we can carry out change, and we can amend the current laws, policies, and other initiatives so that the society in true sense can be empowered. And we cannot do that without having the target population included. So we must make it possible for more and more people from the target population be included in the decision making capacity, so that they also feel included, their journeys feel validated, their narrative is highlighted. So this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Aiswin. I think that with that, I think it's a good note to end. I think we need to recognize gender inequality. If you are looking for gender equality, promoting gender equality, the people are the central. I think it is a prerequisite. The agency is a prerequisite, and so therefore it is non-negotiable. I think I echo what Aiswin was stressing. I think any gender equality promotion can only be purposeful and meaningful if the people themselves voice their concerns. So thank you very much for your active participation. See you on Wednesday. We have, like as usual, I think we are going to have a discussion on valuing women's unpaid domestic and care work. And then we will look at in terms of gender public policies and budgets. So see you on Wednesday, same time. Thank you very much for your participation. I think there are quite a number of about 15 people were active. I would like if others also would. I know that there are some people active in the chat. Unfortunately, I am not able to read all of them at time because I can't handle both facilitating the session and reading that. But thank you very much for people who have participated in the session, as well as people who have expressed their comments in the chat. See you on Wednesday. Thank you. Bye-bye. See you.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.